Ladies and gentlemen, Rosia and her weapon aren't the only things arriving in the second half of version 2.0. As you all are pretty familiar with the banner schedule, we've got another rerun, and this time it's for a very popular character, Jinhsi. And with Jinhsi's rerun, we're gonna have something else. It's gonna be her weapon. And there have been a lot of people asking, especially based off some of their spending habits in version 1.1, maybe they might have been focused more on pulling characters instead of weapons. There are a lot of people asking whether or not Age of Harvest is worth it. And I'm here today to break down whether or not it is, going over things like its base stats, going over things like its weapon effect, and perhaps most importantly, knowing how weapons are shareable in endgame content like the Tower of Adversity, whether or not it's worth the pull based off the use cases on other members of the roster. Let me just be upfront when I say that this actually is one of the highest value weapons in the game. And so let's go ahead and break it down and explain exactly why. So, for the base stats of the weapon, at a baseline at level 90, synchronization rank 1, it's going to have an attack of 587 and a critical rate of 24.3. The nice thing about this weapon is that it has the highest or best in class base attack across all 5-star weapons, much higher than the 500 you've seen on weapons like Carlotta's or Yinlin's or Jeja's, while also unfortunately having a lower critical stat to sort of make up for that bonus. However, the nice thing about this critical stat is that it's in critical rate. And so the comparison that I always like to draw when it comes to Wuthering Waves, and let me just pull up some additional information. In Wuthering Waves, a critical weapon is going to have a higher critical stat than a 4 cost. You're seeing over here my max rank Wind Gorilla is going to be about 22% crit rate, while the weapon is 24.3. And that means inherently you want to use the opposite critical stat on the 4 cost than you have on the weapon. And so in Jinhsi's case, for example, her Jue for me is a critical damage one. And so because of the fact that the critical rate that we're seeing over here is higher than what we typically see on 4 costs, that's going to make it a little bit easier to balance out your critical stats. And we all know how important critical rate is to actually dealing your damage, because if you don't crit, all of that investment in critical damage simply goes nowhere. It actually doesn't happen. And missing crits on Jinhsi is one of the most devastating things you can do across your gameplay, because she centers around one big nuke in her kit, and it needs to crit for her to function as well as you want her to. And so her weapon, basically being a critical rate 1, is a great asset to her character. And most importantly, it's a great asset to every other character that might be using this weapon. And let me tell you this, based off its weapon skill, there's a lot of applicable users. Perhaps the most out of any 5-star weapon on the roster, other than Stringmaster, but that thing's fucking busted. So with that, let's go ahead and dive right on into the weapon skill. So the weapon skill is called Divine Blessing. It grants a 12% attribute damage bonus, which in my opinion is the best attribute damage bonus to have on a weapon. For example, other weapons like Chang Li's, Kamelia's, and as well as Rosia's, which is coming out in the same patch cycle, they instead increase attack by 12%. And let me just say that an attribute damage bonus is typically way more applicable than attack. First, it'll work on users who don't actually scale on attack, like Tao Chi, for example, and a 12% attribute damage bonus is a lot harder to find than a 12% attack bonus. You can just get 11.6% as a roll on your substats. But when it comes to damage bonus, you can only roll one of the 4 damage types, like basic attack, resonant skill, liberation, or heavy. And what that means is that this 12% attribute damage bonus in general is going to get you a lot more mileage compared to a regular general attack bonus. So that's a big win for the weapon right off of the bat. However, that's just only one part of the pie. We got to get into the actual weapon skill itself. So for this weapon, casting an intro skill gives you a buff called Ageless Marking, which basically grants you 24% resonant skill damage for 12 seconds. Casting a resonant skill from there, it gives you a second buff called Ethereal Endowment, which grants another 24% resonant skill damage bonus. This obviously synergizes really well with Jinhsi's kit. She gains the max bonus really fast, and she'll end up, dealing a bunch of damage with the ability, stacking up to 48% overall. So we already know it works great on Jinhsi. Let's go ahead and dive into some of its other potential users. So the very first user that I'm going to be talking about is Jian. And let me just be honest when I say that this weapon functions pretty surprisingly well with him. The first reason being that based off a Jian Sonata set, he wants to use intro skills in the first place to even activate Sierra Gale. So that means that this first part of the weapon buff, right, that activates off of an intro skill, it's not a problem. Next up, his baseline resonance skill, right, Wind Queller. he uses this quite frequently across his rotations. He could use it as he's activating his Echo skill, or he can simply use it during his Resonance Liberation to buff the damage of the ability by 20%. This basically can be freely cast to reposition himself. It's freely cast at the end of his rotations as well to get some additional resonance energy, and it can also be cast to cancel one of his Qinglongs in the middle of its animation, deal the damage of the Qinglong attack during his liberation, while also stacking on the damage of his resonance skill on top. And this has even more synergy if your Jian is like mine and has C1 or S1, because you'll be able to cast this resonance skill 2 times pretty freely during his liberation, and that also means, right, that you're stacking up that damage bonus even more and more. He wants to use his resonance skill as often as possible to make up for his energy regen problems that he might have if you're not using it. If you're at like 140%, you never actually have to use it, and using it can be a DPS loss with his signature. But in all honesty, Jian clears very, very, very well and very, very, very easily using Jinhsi's weapon because of how seamless it is to actually activate in his kit. And I myself used Jinhsi's weapon on Jian for basically the entirety of versions 1.1 all the way to 1.3. And then I pulled his weapon on the rerun because I like the character. So with that, we've got one user down. You obviously will have to use a crit damage forecast and then reform a crit rate one if you swap to his weapon. But in all honesty, you never need to get great results out of it for this character. Next up, we're gonna have another member of the roster, which, well, frankly, not a lot of people are using anymore. And that is Calcharo. Let's be honest here, ladies and gentlemen. Most people are not using this character at all ever since they pulled Zhang Liao, because Zhang Liao, frankly, feels a lot better to use in a lot of circumstances. However, Calcharo does benefit a lot from actually using Age of Harvest on him. And that's because, ladies and gentlemen, Calcharo uses his resonance skills. He uses his resonance skills to actually activate his baseline Forte circuit or the heavy attack Mercy. And what happens when you use the heavy attack Mercy is that you actually gain a resonance liberation damage bonus. I don't think it's supposed to say 1 second. It's supposed to say a lot longer than 1 second. So using that heavy attack Mercy gives him a buff that when he goes into his resonance liberation will buff all of the outgoing damage that he's actually going to do. I do think this is actually a typo. This doesn't make any sense at all. And so with that buff, you can go ahead and deal a lot more damage. You need to cast this resonance skill, however, 3 times to actually make it happen. And so what this means, ladies and gentlemen, is that you're using this often. You can use it during his resonance liberation as well to cancel the animations of some of his abilities and actually speed up his attack chain. And all Jinhsi's weapon does is provide more and more of that incremental damage as he goes through his rotation. And let's be honest here, the scaling on this isn't amazing, but it's still something. Calcharo's biggest benefit from using this weapon, however, is simply the intense boost that it's going to give to his critical rate. And that's going to make balancing his stat profile a lot easier and allow him to get a lot more just overall damage through critical damage that you're not going to be getting if you're using the standard 5-star on him, because that standard 5-star gives no critical stats at all. And so it's going to make him easier to build. It's going to make him a lot more powerful with those resonance skills. You might get higher damage if you have super optimal echoes on the standard broadblade. But overall, Jinhsi's weapon just makes him feel a lot more comfortable to use for a majority of players. All right, next up, we're going to have everyone's favorite 4-star released in version 1.4, and that's going to be Lumi. And so based off of that, right, Lumi has boost to critical rate in her skill tree, and she also uses her resonance skills pretty often, right? She uses her resonance skills pretty often across her rotations to actually activate and switch out between the modes and generate her Forte circuit, between the blasting mode and the actual melee mode that she has. And that means, ladies and gentlemen, she can actually activate this bonus very frequently as well. Her resonance skill, ladies and gentlemen, actually has no cooldown at all as far as I'm concerned. It mainly has a stamina cost that prevents you from using it too much. And so you're going to have constant access to this uptime. You need to use these resonance skills with her Forte circuit to actually deal the damage in the first place, and you have all these energized pounces and these energized rebounds that are going to get buffed. In my opinion, it is probably Lumi's best overall 5-star weapon if you are, deciding to invest in her, and it synergizes pretty well with her kit, and there's not really other options that are going to work out for her. You could think about using Jian's weapon, but she doesn't really do that much heavy attack damage. Or you can use Jian's weapon for heavy attack damage, but overall, with the better critical rate, the more balancing of substance, I would bet on Jinhsi's weapon on her regardless. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for our final user, it's going to be everybody's favorite character, Tao Chi. Or really, nobody's favorite character. But she's seeing a lot more use now that Carlotta has come out and she's a great buffer for her. Unfortunately, Tao Chi is probably the worst user of Jinhsi's weapon across the entire broadblade roster. That's because her concerto energy generation sucks ass. It's really fucking slow. And what that means is that her best alternative in most circumstances is Discord. And the reason why Discord is probably her best weapon is due to the fact that, well, it helps alleviate her concerto energy generation problems. Another reason why Discord is so great is because, well, all of Tao Chi's abilities pretty much scale off of defense. Like, all of them. And so what that means is the high base attack of Jinhsi's weapon doesn't actually do anything for her. She's not gaining any benefit out of that base attack. She's only getting benefit from the crit rate, the resonance skill damage buff, and as we're seeing over here, this resonance skill doesn't really do that much damage in the first place. Her resonance skill, right, it's doing 67.86 at level 1, and then it's scaling up like that, about 6% per level. It's not really that good. And so what that means is she's not gaining a lot of bonuses from the actual base stats of the weapon itself, one of the big reasons why you get a 5-star. And she's a lot better on Discord, where she doesn't have any problems with the weapon's very low base attack because she scales off of defense. And so because of that, I don't recommend pulling Jinhsi's signature for Tao Chi. I don't think there's really a lot of use cases at all that make sense for her, and most people are going to get a lot more mileage out of using her as a buffer, and honestly, like, probably like a DPS too. I'm using Discord, just because it's going to let you move on to the other characters in your roster a lot faster, or the other characters on your team a lot faster and get more mileage that way. Overall though, we've looked at a bunch of users, and Tao Chi, as the more like supportive defense scaler, is the only one that doesn't really work that well with this weapon effect or the base stats on it. So in all honesty, 3 out of 4, not counting Jinhsi herself, is pretty damn good. And this weapon, again, based off of those critical stats, is going to make building those characters a lot easier. And so keep that in mind as you're getting ready to pull, because this is, like I mentioned before at the start of this conversation, right, this is one of the highest value 5-star weapons in the game, at least in my opinion, and it's usable on a lot of characters and you'll get a lot of mileage out of it. So we've covered the weapon value. Let's get into some of the upgrades. This is pretty much business as usual, right? We're going to have the standard broadblade upgrade materials. We're also going to have all the Whispering cores to actually get it upgraded, and this is going to be really easy stuff to access right through all of the mats that Kuro's been giving us, and obviously your ability to farm them. I do recommend farming, if you're farming for this weapon, to do it in the 1.0 zones rather than the 2.0 zones, because you'll be able to get these actual Whispering cores instead of like all the title residuums or whatever the fuck they're called from the drops in Renacida. The only difference between the Renacida forgery challenges and the 1.0 forgery challenges is what actual secondary mat you're getting. So focus on the 1.0 ones if you want to make the farming go by a little bit smoother for you. But that's going to be it. And if you're debating between this and Rosia's weapon, right, you got a couple of extra pulls, I do recommend pulling this one instead, especially if you have Jinhsi and you don't have her weapon. You know, you're obviously going to be supercharging your Jinhsi, and you're going to be getting a lot more value on other characters on your roster. But if you already have, let's just say, Jian's weapon, for example, maybe this isn't like the best pull ever, because you already got like a crit broadblade, and it might only be worth it if you're really just trying to supercharge Jinhsi. That's the situation. So with that, let me know what you all think. Did I cover everything well? Did I miss any use cases? And yeah, see you all next time. Peace out.